Welcome, everyone. My name is Frank Billet, and as the Program Director of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies at UC Berkeley, I want to thank you for joining us today for our last lecture of the fall semester. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to announce 3 events in the spring semester. First, on February 2nd, starting at 4 p.m., a 2-part event entitled Music of the Great Tang, Historical Performance in 21st Century China, organized by Gus Holly, a PhD student in ethnomusicology and the recipient of the Clancy Fellowship in Silk Road Studies. This event will start with a lecture and end with a musical performance of Tang music. Second, on February 16th, a conference titled Ruling Together, Consultation and Collaboration in the Political Regimes of Pre-Modern Eurasia. Third, on April 18th, the annual Tang Lecture in Silk Road Studies, which will be delivered by Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History at the University of Oxford, entitled Conceptualizing the Silk Roads. You can find more detailed information on these and all our other events on our website's calendar. We hope you would be able to join us. Now back to the present. Our speaker today is Dr. Robert Spangler. Dr. Spangler directs the ERC-funded project, Fruits of Eurasia Domestication and Dispersal. He also leads the Domestication and Anthropogenic Evolution Research Group and oversees the Paleoethnobotany Laboratory at the Max Planck Institute for Geoanthropology in Jena, Germany. He is the co-PI on the Arcadia Fund project, Mongolian archaeological project Surveying the Steppe. Dr. Spangler received his PhD in anthropology from Washington University, St. Louis in 2013, and held several positions before his current affiliation, including as a visiting scholar at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, and as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the German Institute of Archaeology and the Freie Universität in Berlin. As a specialist in archaeobotany, among others, Dr. Spangler spends considerable time in the field as an affiliate of several archaeological projects across Eurasia, such as in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and China. Among his many publications is the much celebrated book, Fruits from the Sands, The Silk Road Origins of the Food We Eat, published by the University of California Press. In this book, Dr. Spangler takes us on a journey along millennia-old networks of exchanges to discuss the long history of the domestication of plants and the dispersal process that ultimately brought them to our table. He is the author of 2 co-edited volumes, Introduction and Intensification of Agriculture in Central Eurasia and Adjacent Regions, and Mobility and Ancient Society in Asia and the Americas. Finally, he has published many articles on topics such as ancient animal economies, domestication of crops, land use patterns, social complexity in Bronze and Iron Age Central Asia, and Silk Road exchanges. His next book, Domesticating Earth, The Origins of Agricultural Debates, is in press. Today, he will speak on his most recent archaeological investigations into the dispersal of plants and animals in Central Asia. Robert, I look forward to listening to your talk.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great introduction, Frank. And I will share my screen, and I'm glad to be here and be able to discuss some of the ongoing research that my team in Jena, Germany is engaged in currently. And in many ways, I see this talk as an extension onto the book Fruit from the Sands, which was just mentioned. It's essentially the research that has been going on in regards to the spread of domesticated plants and animals across the ancient world since I wrote that book. And there's been a lot of new discoveries and revelations. So I'll jump right in and start by introducing my research group. So we are at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology, the former Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. I run a wonderful team of postdocs and graduate students, and I'll say right at the beginning of this talk that the research presented in here is not just my work, it's a collaborative endeavor of a large number of scholars from all over the world. And this wonderful team of students and postdocs have really chipped in their expertise to make all of this possible. They're funded largely through a series of grants. So the ERC-funded grant, Fruits of Eurasia Domestication Dispersal, the Max Planck-funded grant, Domestication Anthropogenic Evolution, and then the Arcadia Fund grant, MAPS, which is the Mongolian Archaeological Project, which kind of runs autonomously. We do have ongoing research projects that span much of the temperate zone of the northern hemisphere of the world, and every one of the black dots on the screen there is one of our ongoing projects currently. But we do focus the research primarily on the mountain foothill zones of Central Asia. And throughout most of my career thus far, this is the area that I have focused my work. And the reason for this specific focus is that human population densities in the past, as in today, in these open grasslands of Central Asia, the steppe regions that we hear so much about when we read history books or archaeological books on Central Asia, they've always been very low. Human population densities at the mountain tops as well are very low. And this has led to a kind of corridor or a funneling of people and goods and ideas through these mountain river zones of Central Asia. These mountain river zones have rich landscapes that are biodiverse, and they're fed all summer long through glacial melt streams. So they're the perfect landscapes in many ways to foster both agricultural endeavors, but also pastoral activities. And in this way, this corridor of exchange connected the prehistoric world long before the formations of the Silk Road, or what we think of as the more historically documented trade routes in Central Asia. Now, the ways that this corridor of exchange shaped the cultures that we're also familiar with today, or specifically the cuisines, what I'll be talking about today, this is not a new research topic. In fact, back in 2012, my dissertation advisor, Michael Frschetti, coined the term Inner-Asian Mountain Corridor to talk about this process, this kind of cultural phenomena, and how he saw it happening, specifically referring to Bronze Age pastoral populations moving short distances through these river valleys with their seasonal herd movements, and then a diffusionist process leading to the movement of ideas across the Bronze Age world. He was building on earlier work by his advisor, Gregory Paussel, who talked about a Middle Asian interaction sphere. And Paussel was more interested in Southern Central Asia, but it's still this process of continual exchange and interaction that is intensified over time, ultimately leading to what we historically refer to as the Silk Road. Now, all of this was building on earlier work by Andrew Sherritt, who talked about the Great Eurasian or Trans-Eurasian Exchange. And Sherritt was particularly interested in domesticated plants and animals. And he, too, noted that the Bronze Age world was not a series of isolated populations, but that through diffusionist processes, people in this broader Eurasian reality were connected and ideas were moving across continents. Many other scholars have simply referred to this as the pre-Silk Road Exchange, or what Elena Kuzmina in her book by the title calls the prehistory of the Silk Road. So back in 2006, when I started working on the topic of the spread of agriculture across Eurasia, I quickly adopted the idea of an Inner-Asian mountain corridor to the spread of agriculture concept. And it became very clear that the agricultural traditions of the Bronze Age were actually already made up of an intermingling of East Asian and Southwest Asian agricultural crops and cultivation techniques. And this idea was later picked up by Martin Jones and his colleagues when they presented their own model of food globalization in prehistory, an article critiqued by Nicole Boivin and her colleagues when they presented their own model of crop translocations along the Proto-Silk Road, and still further, Chris Stevens and his colleagues referred to a Middle Asian corridor of crop dispersal. So from the archaeological perspective, these questions are not new, and they have received a considerable amount of attention from scholars. but long before the archaeologists jumped into the space. The Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, who coined the term Silk Road, was already writing on similar topics in 1877, and the linguist Berthold Laufer was already using linguistic methods to talk about the spread of crops across the ancient world. Edward Schaefer, in his key book, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, in many ways the precursor to my book, Fruit from the Sands, talked about these ideas as well. But we are currently doing research in a modern world, and these ideas are no longer approachable from a simple mono-method approach. And the research that we are doing in this project today is a conglomerate of methods bringing together archaeobotany, what my team does, with genetic or genomics methods, molecular methods, and also linguistics and historical methods, the core of much of this research coming out of history. So I think the common idea of the Silk Road that we are all familiar with today, the idea of Central Asian prehistory, is an open highway of grass that is traversed by highly specialized mobile herders or nomads that would have connected Europe to Asia in prehistoric or early historical periods. And this idea dominates the literature, both from the historical perspective and the archaeological perspective. And many aspects of this idea in the last few years alone have been critiqued. I've already noted that this idea of a steppe highway is really giving way towards an inter-Asian mountain corridor concept. And the highway itself was not necessarily a corridor of long-distance mobility or exchange. In fact, it was potentially hostile towards large-scale movements of people and ideas. Likewise, the highly specialized nature of these nomadic or supposed nomadic populations has really been called into question in the last few years. So this romantic image of a Scythian warrior nomad traversing great distances across the grasslands simply to raid neighboring agricultural communities is no longer an overly popular idea in the literature. But this was still quite popular in 2006 when I first started doing my research in this part of the world. And the map in the background shows the number of archaeobotanical studies that had been conducted. So the studies of plant remains in archaeological sites that had been conducted before I started work in this part of the world. It was in many ways still a blank slate. And when I started, many scholars told me that this was the nomadic world or the pastoralist world, and finding early agriculture was highly unlikely. This map in the background was pulled together in 2019 for an article that I spearheaded in Current Anthropology. These are all data points of archaeobotanical assemblages that show early evidence for agriculture. So they're not individual data points in and of themselves, they're entire assemblages or entire studies of archaeobotanical assemblages from an archaeological site. And they're also a new method that has become increasingly prominent in the archaeology of this part of the world, isotopic studies, specifically looking at human bone collagen to try to interpret what human diet looked like in the past. And all of these data points for isotopes as well show that there was early agricultural activity in Central Asia in the Bronze and Iron Age. Now, in many ways, this is not a small critique. So the idea that not all the people in this part of the world were pastoralists may seem trivial, but it really opens up a new realm of discussion for changes in culture over time, changes in mobility over time, and changes in socio-political systems over time. And just to emphasize that this critique of mobility is not a single study, but rather a large number of interlocked studies by scholars from all across North America and Europe and Asia as well, studying these same research questions. And all coming to similar conclusions that the level of mobility of these populations in the past, especially these supposed pastoral populations, needs to be reevaluated. And pulling together these data sets in an article in Current Anthropology just a few years ago. This is the Imagined Past article, and it was a team endeavor of many of the top archaeological science experts in this field today. The article also summarizes the evidence for early agriculture, and it shows that in the last few years, the earliest agriculture in this part of the world was pushed back by several millennia, and the intensity of agricultural systems, how it took place and when it took place, has also been reevaluated. Many of these supposed nomadic populations of the Iron Age are now being labeled as intensive agricultural economies. And just to focus in on one of these many studies, this is work by my colleague Shevin Wilkin that I had the privilege of collaborating with for this project. And I focus in on this one in particular because this is a study in Mongolia. And in many ways, I think most of our popular images of what the prehistory for this broader part of the world look like reach their pinnacle with Mongolia. So most people think of Mongolia as the pastoralist or the nomadic world in prehistory. But studies of isotopes, carbon and nitrogen isotopes on skeletal remains from across Mongolia spanning the Bronze and Iron Age show that we have an increased reliance in these populations on grain products, specifically millet products, as they lead up to the first empires, Mongolian empires. So specifically the Xiongnu and later empires, there is an increased even further reliance on agricultural grain products, all the way up to the well-known Mongol Empire, which spread across Eurasia. But beyond simply showing that there's an increased reliance on agriculture, this study shows that the diet is diversified over time. So it's not enough to say that these populations were not just specialized nomads, that they had this agro-pastoral system, but actually the overall cultural repertoire and the broader culinary traditions were increasing in complexity over time. And with the increased number of archaeobotanical studies in Central Asia that we're dealing with, and the significant increase in data that we have at hand now, we can start to look beyond simply the presence and absence of specific agricultural grains in assemblages. We can actually talk about the agricultural traditions that were at play. So how were humans growing crops? What did the techniques or technologies in agriculture look like? And specifically in this case study on this slide, when were crop rotation cycles implemented? And this is also a very important archaeological question. So this study was spearheaded by my colleague, Naomi Miller. And again, I was privileged enough to be able to collaborate on this project. And it's a look at the spread of millet into Central Asia. And millet, especially broomcore millet, was an extremely important crop in prehistory in Eurasia. It lost its prominence over time and has today essentially been pushed out of our cuisines. It is gaining some popularity again with whole grain breads or kind of as an alternative sort of hipster style food. But in prehistory, it was one of the most important crops in Eurasia, and it was grown across 2 continents by the late Bronze Age. It was domesticated in northeastern China on the semi-arid grasslands, which has given it a specific set of qualities. Specifically, it is has a short growing season, and it is drought tolerant. And those are traits that are coming from this adaptation to a northern steppe-land region. But they're traits that made it extremely valuable in agricultural systems in early historical periods in Central Asia and in Europe. So when it first moves into Central Asia, it becomes this kind of low investment crop that is picked up by these pastoralists or low investment agro-pastoralist communities. So it works very well as a complement to pastoralist systems. But by about 2,500 years ago, what some historians refer to as the Axial Age, archaeobotanical studies show that it becomes increasingly more prominent in the kind of burgeoning urban centers in southern Central Asia and across Southwest Asia, all the way to the Mediterranean. And what we pulled together through several lines of data in this study is that the reasons for its increased adoption in these cities is the beginnings of these crop rotation cycles. This is where summer crops, specifically in this case, a drought-tolerant millet that is grown on hot, irrigated fields, can be grown on the same plot of land where winter wheat is planted in the fall and harvested in the spring. So the ability to significantly increase grain outputs in a small plot of land around an urban center allowed those urban centers to dramatically increase in human population density and size. So this is, in many ways, one of the main impetuses that allowed for the political changes that we see around 500 BC or the latter part of the last millennium BC, leading to the beginnings of the great empires of the ancient world, and leading to a whole another realm of social complexity that is not seen in the ancient world prior. The same process actually happens in reverse in northern China as well, where archaeobotanical studies show that in the last centuries BC, wheat, a crop from Southwest Asia, becomes increasingly more prominent, and that is almost certainly because it is also worked into similar crop rotation systems, allowing the populations in northern China before the formation of the Han Dynasty to dramatically increase their agricultural outputs. So in many ways, this is where I left off with Fruit from the Sands. I also talk extensively in the book about the beginnings of arboriculture and fruit trees, and to a lesser extent, some of the spices and other crops that are mentioned in historical sources. But there had been very little research by this time of the actual plants found in archaeological sites from the medieval periods along the Silk Road trade routes. Now, over the last 10 years or so, my team has worked at many of the largest urban centers of ancient Central Asia, the hubs on the kind of trading routes of the Silk Road. We are collaborating with many of the largest international archaeological excavations that are ongoing in Central Asia, and we have collected thousands of archaeobotanical samples from hearth features, from middens, trash pits, ash layers, all across Central Asia, which we process to look for small fragments of ancient plant remains, which we then identify in our laboratory in Jena, Germany, under the microscope. We are asking questions such as, when did the origins of arboriculture first take off? So when did humans start cultivating fruit trees or long generation perennials for the first time? And this is actually not a simple question, and it's also an extremely important question to answer when we talk about human cultural developments over time. The idea of planting a plant that will not provide its first crops for up to 10 years is not something we see in the archaeological record prior to about 2,000 years ago. So this is something that's very interesting to really get at because it allows us to understand a concept of land tenure when humans start to invest in a plot of land that will, in their view, be owned by their offspring and beyond their own life expectancies. We're pushing our research agenda forward in time and looking at some of the great imperial transitions in Central Asia. So, for example, when did various Turkic groups move in? When did the Islamic expansions into Central Asia take place? The Mongolian conquests? And what did these massive cultural turnovers mean for the archaeological or the archaeobotanical record? Were there major changes in the agricultural systems over time? And of course, we're also pushing our research agenda further back in time, looking at Bronze Age material and even further than that. We are archaeologists, and the eternal kind of struggle for finding the oldest or the earliest still drives a lot of the research agenda. We do have projects that are spanning all the way back to the early Holocene as well. So we are asking questions related to what hunter-gatherer communities were doing in this part of the world before agriculture was even introduced, and that will allow us to better understand this transition into agriculture, what it looked like, and whether it was kind of a demographic expansion into the region or an adoption of agricultural systems by hunter-gatherer communities already there. So if anybody is familiar with my work, you know that the apple has long been the kind of poster child for our project. We've been very interested in the apple in part because the largest contributor to the modern apple, the largest genetic contributor to our modern apple, is the Tian Shan wild apple, which today only exists in a few river valleys in southeastern Kazakhstan. So it's got a very limited geographic range. It's a protected species, but obviously it is a very important species for our modern economy because it has the greatest genetic diversity within the apple genus, specifically in this one population in the southern parts of Kazakhstan. So in this way, the apple originates in Kazakhstan. But the story for the apple is much more complicated than that. Geneticists have now shown that the modern apple is actually a hybrid of at least 4 different wild apple species that are dispersed across Eurasia. And 3 of these, in their wild form, are quite large already. So before humans started cultivating them or kind of manipulating the morphology of these populations, they already were quite large and quite sweet in their wild state. Now, this means that they were being dispersed by an animal other than a bird. They were too large for birds to be swallowing these kind of large fruiting apples, which vary in size between the size of a golf ball and slightly smaller than a tennis ball in their wild state. So they must have been dispersed by something like a large megafaunal mammal. And this is something we can start to actually theorize when we get the archaeobotanical data mapped out. So all these data points in the background are apple seeds found from Middle Holocene or older archaeological sites. And some of the things that immediately stand out is all of these apple seeds, these ancient finds of apples, map over known glacial refugio zones of the last Pleistocene, places where there were forests during the last ice age. What's even more interesting is they largely are restricted to areas below the extent of the glacial ice sheets in Europe. This suggests that after the ice age ended, when all the other tree species kind of moved back further north with the retreating of the glacial ice sheets, the apple, the wild apple species, specifically these large fruiting wild apple species, did not recolonize the northern regions. They largely stayed in place. And this is usually an indication of a poor wild seed dispersal mechanism. In this case, the extinction of the megafaunal animals of the Pleistocene meant that the seeds were not moving as fast. The apples in the wild were not being consumed and moved by an animal to a new location. And this is interesting for us as archaeologists because humans make the perfect surrogate for megafaunal animals and seed dispersers. So this is one of my Uzbek colleagues who joined us for our research in Kazakhstan this past year in the wild apple forest in southeastern Kazakhstan, where we are working diligently to find the oldest evidence of human interaction with the wild apples. And you can actually see about the size of what these wild apples look like before humans got involved. But essentially, once humans started moving these apples across these disparate populations that, again, mapped over ancient refugial zones, forest refugial zones, they brought them into contact with their ancient wild apple relatives, and essentially the bees did the rest, moving the pollen from one variety of cultivated apple to another variety of cultivated apple, causing them to hybridize. And humans then locked those large fruiting hybrid forms into place through grafting and cloning. So this is really exciting because it shows that there are different processes to domestication that don't quite match what we typically think of as agricultural field crops being cultivated over time, leading to larger seeded varieties. In this case, it's domestication via mobility through human-induced hybridization, and it's essentially domestication via the Silk Road. So the Silk Road not only is responsible for shaping the foods you eat on your dinner table today, it's actually responsible in some cases for driving the evolution of those agricultural crops and those animals that accompanied humans along these trade routes. And in addition to crops that were domesticated via trade on the Silk Road, there's a number of plants, especially long generation perennials or tree crops, that were domesticated in Central Asia proper. And often they're not given credit because most of us don't think of Central Asia as one of these centers for domestication. But one of the kind of more prominent ones that I'm sure everybody is very familiar with that is coming out of Central Asia is the pistachio. A wonderful publication spearheaded by one of my students, Bazir Amir Muhammad, just published this past year, compiling all known evidence for the ancient use by humans of pistachios in Central Asia and also outside of Central Asia, looking at linguistics evidence, again, historical evidence and archaeobotanical evidence. And one of the really surprising realizations in this study was that many of the earliest archaeobotanical finds of pistachio seeds outside of Central Asia were either dated wrong or misidentified. So we can now push forward in time the spread of pistachios outside of their core wild center of dispersal. And this makes some sense because the pistachio is a particularly complicated plant to actually cultivate. So it wasn't until humans had a very strong understanding of arboriculture and tree cultivation that they started to move the pistachio to new locations to cultivate it around different cities across the ancient world. Another big project that my team is engaged in is what we're calling the Paris Project, Prunus Archaeobotanical Research, Investigation, and Survey. We're working on trying to finally sort out the unanswered questions for all of the largest stone fruit crops. This is peaches, apricots, and all of the plums. And this is a 2-continent-wide study that we are engaging in right now. The peach and the apricot are pretty well pinpointed to Eastern China as their zone of origin now. This is a topic that had been debated for the last couple of decades, but archaeobotanical evidence has clearly placed the apricot as well over there. I will note that there is some molecular and genetic studies that have just come out in the last few years that suggest there may actually be a second center of domestication for the apricot in Central Asia, although archaeobotanically we still have not quite found that yet. That is something we are looking for with our studies. But the plum is still one of the big unanswered questions in plant domestication and dispersal in the ancient world. We do find very small specimens of plums from archaeological sites in Turkmenistan, in the Kopet Mountains in far southern Central Asia that go all the way back to the Bronze Age. So they're about 4,000 years old. And this has led us to theorize that there may actually be a similar process of domestication for the European plum as there is for the apple. Essentially, that these cultivated or possibly maintained wild populations of plums in Turkmenistan, once people started moving them closer to Europe, they were brought into contact with wild populations of plums that existed across Europe, leading them to hybridize, creating what we think of as the European plums today. Now, this is still a theory, and this is not something that as archaeobotanists we can test ourselves. So we've joined forces with a team of geneticists from the Smithsonian Institute, and this is a project, a branch of this project led by Logan Kistler, who will be testing the ancient genetics in some of our plum remains. And the reason we can do this study is because the plum pit, the seed or the stone, is extraordinarily dense, and it preserves really well through time in archaeological assemblages. And because of this, in that dense shell, in some cases, the genetic material preserves. And this is something we do not get for most of our ancient plant remains, but we do get it in certain cases for the plum. And based on that ancient genetic material, I think we will be able to finally answer the big questions of domestication and dispersal for the plum. Now, the kind of kickoff publication for this large international collaboration of the broader Prunus studies was published just this past year. This paper was spearheaded by one of my former postdocs who now has a wonderful position at the University of Venice. This is Rita Del Martello. And the study pulls together all the archaeobotanical data for all of the large fruiting prunus species across Europe and Asia, and it maps them out over their wild populations, allowing us to better theorize when and through which routes of dispersal these plants moved through the ancient world. Now, we're also implementing a new and fairly novel method in this study. It's called geometric morphometrics in archaeobotany. So this is essentially archaeobotany, but moved to kind of the next generation of scholarship. We take the seeds under a microscope, a digital microscope, and the microscope itself can do a whole series of morphological measurements on the seeds automatically, and then those measurements can be put into a principal component analysis. Once they're clustered using principal component analysis, we can identify specific populations. So, for example, Prunus domestica here, Prunus cerasifera. So using the computer itself rather than the human eye to differentiate the different populations of ancient Prunus varieties allows us to better separate the varieties than we could do ourselves. And in doing this, we get kind of a new level of analysis beyond simply sitting at a microscope and saying that this is one ancient variety of Prunus and this is another ancient variety of Prunus. And preliminary work seems to suggest that this works very well for deeper time studies of these Prunus species. It gets more complicated when we start to get into, say, the Roman periods, where humans start to plant many different varieties in the same area, either intentionally or unconsciously, leading to hybridization, leading to a much more complicated morphological analysis. So as I already noted, Central Asia is not just an open grassland zone. It is also a series of rich, biodiverse, and agricultural supporting river valleys. In the background here, this is a photo I took from our fieldwork this past summer. This is the Fergana Valley in Kyrgyzstan. It is one of the kind of ancient bread baskets of Central Asia, and it fosters not only a variety of grain crops, but also of water-demanding crops. And in better understanding when humans started investing in these more water-demanding crops, we can start to ask questions related to collective labor in irrigation projects. We can ask questions about commercial systems in Central Asia, when trade routes became increasingly more prominent, and when political systems took a greater hold in this part of the world. So when I visited the Berkeley group, the Tong Center group, this past spring, I already talked about cotton, so I won't go into any great detail here. My team has pulled together a summary paper of our research on the Cotton Road project for consideration for the special edition that you're pulling together. But I will note some interesting points. One is that the ancient variety of cotton spread into Central Asia in the first centuries AD, so almost 2,000 years ago, through from India through Pakistan and up into Central Asia. But what's really interesting about this is it would have been a tree cotton variety, so something very different to what we think of in Central Asia today for cotton, something that would have been 2 meters or more in height when ripe, and would have looked very different than any of the varieties of cotton that kind of all of us are familiar with today. Now, these ancient varieties of cotton that would have been so important in the economic systems in Central Asia in the past are now extinct. The last remnants of them probably being pushed out in the 19th century with the colonial introduction of hybrid forms of New World cotton. So the kind of cultural dynamics of agriculture in Central Asia are constantly changing, but in the last several centuries, the drastic changes in these agricultural systems have really led to the extinction of what we think of as many of these ancient varieties of crops and what might have been there in the past, leaving us only with the archaeobotanical evidence to kind of reconstruct what would have been there. And these are all cotton seeds from this extinct ancient variety, or more likely many ancient varieties of cotton that would have been economically so significant in the medieval periods of Central Asia. But cotton is not the only water-demanding crop that would have been cultivated in ancient Central Asia. So the image in the background is a rice paddy on the edge of the Hiva Oasis. I took this photo 2 summers ago on our fieldwork. This is essentially one of the most hyper-arid deserts in all of Asia. And rice is, of course, one of the most water-demanding crops cultivated in the ancient world. And it's been cultivated in these arid regions in Central Asia for almost 2,000 years. And this is a project that we called the Journey to the West project. It was wrapped up just a few years ago in a publication in 2019. And the basic premise here is we can't think of Central Asian cuisine today without plof or pilaf. It's one of the most important symbols of identity, culinary traditions, and just kind of livelihood in this part of the world. But the question is, how far back in time does this tradition go? We map out the timing and routes of dispersal from thousands of small individual rice grains from archaeological sites across Central Asia in this study. And we note that by just under 2,000 years ago, rice does start to move into Central Asia, likely coming along the kind of northern Himalayan routes, the same routes that cotton likely spread along into southern Central Asia. But it's initially a very minor crop, probably kind of an exotic or elite item. It's mostly found in more elite contexts in Central Asia. And it does become a little more prominent into the medieval period, probably due to increased labor and time investment in irrigation systems, But the extreme reliance on rice in say, the form of plof that we are all familiar with in Central Asia today is probably a much more recent phenomenon than we had previously recognized. So the dispersal of rice seems to follow two routes, and not surprisingly, if you're familiar with the history of the archaeology of this part of the world, the northern route maps out over the kind of well-known routes of the Silk Road, and the southern route follows what is sometimes referred to as the spice or incense routes, or the sea links routes along a southern coastal region. So kind of up the Persian Gulf or up the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. And this same route of dispersal is very well historically documented as key routes of interaction and exchange in the ancient world. And new evidence is suggesting it's not just rice moving around along these two routes roughly 2,000 years ago. Another organism that I think we're all very familiar with, and this is the chicken. So our chicken project, which I was very happily calling the project of when did the chicken cross the road? So when did chickens first appear on the Silk Road? It was just accepted in Nature Communications last week, the final write-up for this study, although the editors did tell us that we have to change our title to something more scientific. But the When Did the Chicken Cross the Road project has just come to an end. And it's a slightly different way of looking at animal remains in archaeological sites. So roughly 8 years ago, while doing the plant research on these sites, in these archaeobotanical assemblages, I started to find small fragments of eggshells. And these are 2 to 4 millimeters in diameter. So they're extremely small crushed fragments of eggshells. And I knew that they were significant, but I didn't know how significant they were going to become. So I started collecting them. And over the course of the last 8 years, from 15 different archaeological sites, spanning a time span from 400 BC to 1000 AD, we ended up with an assemblage of several 100,000 of these small fragments from many different anthropogenic contexts. So they're clearly extremely important. Eggs were clearly a very important part of the economy from 400 BC through the medieval periods in Central Asia. But of course, we needed to properly identify them. And we could get a rough identification using morphological methods. So these are SEM, scanning electron microscope images of an ancient fragment of eggshell, and the individual pore breathing hole structures on these eggshells are fairly diagnostic as chickens. However, that is not enough in and of itself to declare these as chicken eggshells. We also used a new method in the archaeological sciences, something called ZOOMS. It's zooarchaeology through mass spectrometry. And this study was done by a graduate student at our institute who is now defended. So this is Carly Peters, who is able to look at the protein signal within these very small eggshell fragments and match it to the modern domesticated chicken. So clearly we have chickens in Central Asia through time. And we can show when chickens first moved into this part of the world for the first time a little more than 2,000 years ago. But we can also argue for something else here. We can pretty clearly argue that humans are raising these chickens for eggs, presumably also for meat and maybe also for sport, for cockfighting. But eggs are clearly an important part of why they're being raised. And that's important because this is the first time anywhere in the world that we can show clearly that these chickens had lost their wild laying patterns. So a wild progenitor for the modern chicken lays 1 brood of eggs per year and roughly 6 eggs in a nest. Now, if you were raising chickens for their eggs and you only got 6 eggs out of a chicken for the year, then you would not have enough eggs to reproduce your chicken population and also eat them. So clearly these chickens were laying more than 6 eggs a year, and they were not just laying them at one moment in time, kind of in synchronous with all the other chickens. It's being laid as a pattern through a larger period of the year. So this is the first time we can really show that these chickens had evolved a domestication trait for more complex laying patterns, and we theorize in the study that this is what led to their rapid dispersal in the last centuries BC across 2 continents. So by roughly 2,000 years ago, they had already reached China, and they had already reached the UK in Europe. Mapping out the dispersal again using archaeological materials or chicken bones from archaeological sites, and also now our eggshell fragments, we can also show that they likely follow 2 routes of dispersal, this northern Central Asian route to dispersal and this southern route through the coastal regions up the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean, where they became one of the most important animals of the Roman Empire. Chickens are not the only animal that needs more study in the archaeological records for Central Asia. Things such as the pig have largely been overlooked, and this is arguably because most people don't think of the broader Islamic world as having pigs in it. But before the spread of Islam, pigs were clearly very important in southern Central Asia. The archaeological site in the background here, this is the Bash Tepe site. This is an excavation directed by Zoran Stark from NYU. And these pig bones are coming out of this project dating to the last centuries BC. We also find a large number of fish bones from the site, suggesting in this case that this landscape looked very different when humans were living here, possibly large lakes and marshes. And you can see in the background, it's hyper arid today. These are, in this case, these are large carp bones, Asian carp. But we also find extremely small bones in our archaeobotanical assemblages from fish the size of anchovies or sardines. And we're theorizing that there was a kind of robust trade in salted, dried fish, getting fish into some of the more remote regions of Central Asia, especially into the medieval periods. We're also doing right now one of the largest or one of the first microfaunal studies in archaeology of Central Asia. So my colleague Noel Amano is studying these small animal bones that we're finding in these assemblages, looking at things such as the earliest introduction for the brown rat, the black rat, and the house mouse. And all of the rodent bones are going on to York, where our colleague David Orton is currently running the Rattus project, trying to understand how these animals evolved to be commensals with humans. And we can say very clearly that these medieval cities of ancient Central Asia were overrun with rodents, rats. So it's a kind of a different aspect of life in these ancient cities that we often don't think of. And I'm also really interested in the commensal rodents for another reason. It adds one more dimension to our question of mobility. So highly mobile pastoralist populations don't have rodents living in their yurts or their tents. If people move regularly, the rodents tend not to keep up with them. But if you stay sedentary as an ancient population in one location for most of the year, house mice or rats will move in and raid your grain crops. So once commensal rodents started moving into human populations, we can say that those populations started to become sedentary. And this is something that we are now using as another line of evidence to talk about mobility in ancient Central Asia. So one of the more exciting of the projects that has contributed to this rodent project, that's contributed eggshell fragments to our study, it's contributed to many of the fruit studies we're dealing with, is the Bukhara project. This is also directed by Zoran Stark. It is a rescue project just next to the Ark in ancient Bukhara. So if any of you are familiar with the ancient city of Bukhara, the kind of citadel structure is still intact in the ancient city today, and it can be visited. Right next to that structure, there is a rescue excavation that has extremely deep anthropogenic context going back almost 2,000 years. Large amount of that material is from kind of this Karakhanid period, this this later era of the medieval period in Central Asia. And it's largely an elite context. So we get this beautiful repertoire of food remains coming out of these archaeological contexts, along with archaeological material. And then for our interests as archaeobotanists, one of the most exciting aspects of the large number of cesspits in the assemblage. And essentially, these are ancient toilet contexts, which most people would not be overly eager to climb down into an ancient cesspit. But this is my student, Bazir Amir Muhammad here, who is very eagerly collecting archaeobotanical samples from down in the bottom of one of these medieval cesspits. And I will say that this is why it's so good to have graduate students, so you can send them in to do the dirty work for you. But in this case, the hard work that she has put into this has paid off, and we have from this site of Bukhara, this excavation at Bukhara, the most robust archaeobotanical assemblage ever compiled for Central Asia, and it is extraordinarily well preserved. These cesspits preserve seeds and plant remains that normally would not preserve in an archaeological assemblage. So we're able to actually talk about things that normally we would never be able to find in an archaeobotanical assemblage. And just to give you some ideas of the large number of things that are coming out of these medieval contexts, we have the earliest evidence, archaeobotanical evidence in Central Asia for mulberries. And this is something that I always get asked when I give these talks: when did the first mulberries move into Central Asia? And that's specifically because people are very interested in knowing whether there was actually silk on the Silk Road. And normally I have to tell them that mulberries do not readily preserve in archaeobotanical assemblages, so we normally can't find them. And that's not to say they were not there in earlier time periods. It just means we need to find very specific ancient contexts to find the very small seeds of the mulberry fruit. This happens to be one of the earliest of those specific contexts, so we can say that by 1,000 years ago, by the Karakhanid period, mulberries were being consumed in Central Asia, and judging by the sheer number of seeds coming out of these sites, they were quite prominent in these ancient medieval cities out in the desert. Figs, too, another one that does not readily preserve in our archaeological record in most cases, but in these ancient cesspits, they preserve very well. So we're able to talk about the fact that by 1,000 years ago, figs were prominent in these assemblages. Pomegranate, of course, also does not typically preserve in these assemblages, but they do in these cesspits. Pomegranate's a bit of a different one because we already knew that it would have been present in Central Asia, and we know that from art historical depictions. Pomegranates depicted on ceramic vessels are quite prominent in Central Asia, especially in the later medieval periods. But now it's nice to have the archaeobotanical evidence to link that together. One of my favorite fruits from Central Asia, the melon, and the diversity of melons in ancient Central Asia is absolutely astonishing. And we find melon seeds of different sizes, likely representing different varieties of ancient melons. And the watermelon, for the first time identified in Central Asia. And this is something that very much interests me, not for the fact that we found watermelon specifically, but for the fact that this is the oldest African domesticate to make it this far north in the ancient world. So by 1,000 years ago, a plant domesticated in North Africa had already made its way into the central regions of Central Asia. So that's a pretty exciting discovery. And then some of the first spices, and spices too, we have a pretty good understanding of what spices were moving along these trade routes from historical sources, but until now they had largely been lacking in the archaeological record. And that's because they usually do not preserve in these assemblages. But for the first time, talking about things like cumin seed or coriander and sumac as well. And the last plant that I'll talk about moving along these ancient trade routes, this is a higher THC level cannabis. So not the cannabis cultivated for oil seeds or for fiber, but actually being used for ritual or medicinal purposes. And this is a fascinating project that I was very excited to be able to take part in. It was directed by Yiming Yang and his student Meng Ren at the IVPP in Beijing. It's from several years ago, but they analyzed the burnt inside of wooden burners found in burials in far western China at high elevations. Because they were at high elevations, the preservation is absolutely amazing. So this is a unique case where the chemical signature of what was burned in there is preserved, where in most cases it would not preserve. Specifically noting that humans were already using cannabis for its psychoactive ingredients by 2,500 years ago. So just to kind of wrap all this up, I will note that this kind of fruits from the sands discussion, the spread of plants and animals across these ancient exchange routes, this is actually only one half of the research that my broader team is engaged in. The other half is the study of domestication. And I touched on some of this with, say, the apple domestication in this talk, or the domestication of commensal rodents. And this is the topic of my forthcoming book, Domesticating Earth, where I look at the ways that humans in the ancient world drove the evolution of different plants and animals. Among other things, I argue to have Central Asia added to the maps of centers of domestication for the ancient world, specifically these kind of hybridization belts. So the southern coastal route, the spice route, and the Silk Road proper. They are clearly routes that played an important role in driving evolution across the ancient world. But I also have a large number of recent studies and publications that call into question what exactly it is that we mean when we talk about early domestication and how this process unfolded. But this is a topic for another talk.
It's incredibly important because it allows us to separate.
And that is some of my team doing flotation, so you can get a little bit of an idea of what it is that they're actually engaged in there, and what it looks like to do flotation in the field. The methods of sample collecting in the field are extremely simple, but the complicated part takes off when we get the samples into the lab under a microscope, and we have to identify all of these small seeds. So with that, I will end the talk, and hopefully I left some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this amazing talk. I mean, I love listening to you and talking about your research. It's really fascinating. I like the fact that you painted kind of a different picture of what a lot of people imagine about Central Asia as being just a corridor, of moving one thing, connecting basically Europe with China, but really kind of a center of domestication in its own right. So I think that's also kind of changing the perceptions that people have of Central Asia, right? Is that something that you see as well, kind of being reverberated more generally?
Yeah, and it's a bit complicated because I still use the term corridor a lot in this talk, but in Fruit from the Sands, I do argue that we should think of it more as the spokes on a wagon wheel, kind of the entire ancient world coming into Central Asia and then going out of Central Asia. It was the point of connection for all of Eurasia and North Africa.
Right. I noted also you said it's easier to track the evolution of certain fruit, like the stone fruit, because they preserve sometimes the DNA that's in them. And I mean, we think about grapes, because grapes is such an important crop in Central Asia today, right? It's such an important fruit culturally. So I'm just wondering if there's any way that it's possible, because it's such small seeds. Do you find
grape seeds preserve really well in our assemblages. So we tend to get a lot of grape seeds, especially from the medieval context. So whatever humans were using them for, whether into the Islamic periods they were still producing wine in Central Asia, or if it was for essentially raisins, then we can't really say that with the archaeobotanical assemblages, but we can say through the medieval period. So the earliest grape seeds in southern Central Asia are kind of at the tail end of the Bronze Age, and by the Iron Age, they make their way all the way up to Kazakhstan and into Xinjiang. And by the medieval periods, they're extremely prominent, probably one of the most important fruits in these ancient Silk Road cities.
Okay. We have an online question saying, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. Is there any example of the description of fruit on the Silk Road in ancient travel literature or in artworks, like tomb murals, for instance, might have inspired scientific discoveries? So would have been noticing that things were represented in art, and then kind of
I always say this, and I'll emphasize it again, but I think the first place to start with all of these studies is historical sources and art historical sources, and then use the archaeology and these new methods in archaeology to build on that. So I am not a historian or an art historian, but I work very closely with many, and I'm constantly learning from them things that I thought were new discoveries, and I find out, oh, they knew all this stuff long ago. So there's a need now to team up between these different kind of worlds in the academic networks. So yeah, we've learned a lot from art historical material. But in Central Asia, there are certain things that tend to be repeatedly depicted. Like I mentioned, the pomegranate on ceramic vessels depicted over and over again. The grape is another one that's depicted a lot in medieval kind of mural or other kind of genre of art. But because only certain ones are depicted over and over again, the vast majority of things are not necessarily depicted in these paintings or wall frescoes or other or ceramic forms.
It would depend on their status as well, right? There's certain things that are so common that there would maybe no need to portray them. They're taken for granted, right? Or that's something that would be high status might be emphasized. Right.
Yeah. I mean, the one we're working on right now is the chicken. So there's a surprisingly large number of art historical depictions of chicken, and I'm struggling to pull them all together right now. But I think it's largely tied into Zoroastrianism. So the half human, half rooster priests of Zoroastrianism are depicted on, say, Sogdian funerary couches and other sources across Central Asia, but because the rooster became such a prominent religious symbol, it is depicted quite a bit. So the fact that we have eggshell fragments does not, in and of itself, show just how important the chicken was in Central Asia, but the eggshell fragments in combination with all this art historical material really shows the bigger picture for the chicken. And clearly these ancient cities not only had mice and rats running around them, but they had chickens running everywhere as well. So it's a very different image than I would have thought of these ancient cities just 10 years ago.
Yeah, and it's what a pity they made you change the title. I really liked it. That was really fun. Yeah, you said also something about the Mongols, and that you can see the increased reliance on agricultural products and diversification of diet. But I was wondering to what extent that depended on trade rather than actually people being able to grow it, because Mongolia is not a place where you can grow a lot of crops, right?
And so some of that is going to be something you're going to have to stay tuned to hear more about. There's just been so little archaeobotanical research in Mongolia, and I've been trying to work there for almost a decade now, and I keep failing, and that's because of the wind depletion. So the archaeological sites, very few of them, especially in the core areas of Mongolia, have any stratigraphic integrity. The high winds across Central Asia actually just blow the sediments right off the surface. And essentially, these archaeological sites have no preservation of plant material anymore. So much of the data we would need to answer that question is missing. But I think in the future, we'll have a better idea of how much of the plant material that these people are eating is being traded in and how much of it is being cultivated locally. Although I tend to be skeptical of the idea that the commoners would be trading grain over long distances in the ancient world, simply because it is extremely costly on pack animals or labor animals to move heavy grain across long distances. You actually have to feed the animals, so it starts to diminish the value of the grain itself to move it over huge distances. So likely on a smaller scales, kind of low investment agricultural systems, grain was being cultivated across the river valleys in Mongolia, but still a population heavily reliant on pastoralism. So it's not to completely erase the idea of the Mongolian nomad or the Mongolian pastoralist, but I call on that one because I think it is one of the more extreme examples of changing our view of the role of agriculture through time.
Right. Okay, thank you. So I will just end here. Thank you again so much for this fascinating talk. Every time I learn so much from them. And I hope we'll see you very soon in Berkeley. So I look forward to that. So
thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to talk on any of this stuff more. If anybody's interested in following up, my website, spenglerlab.com, is pretty accessible. So there's a lot more information on there beyond what I just talked about here. And many of our publications are accessible on there as well. So, and again, I do hope I get to see you again soon at one of these events, and hopefully something where I can promote them.
I'm sure. Right. Yeah, we look forward to hearing more about that one.
Great.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.